right, so this next video is going to talk about our timeline hierarchy and how our layers and timelines work together in order to create your final project. We'll talk about the various building blocks of PIXERA and how we can use those building blocks to start to create our project file and begin to build complexity into our show. Let's jump in. Let's take a quick look at this diagram that we've got here, which shows us the building blocks of a PIXERA project from largest to smallest. And we obviously start with the timeline. And a timeline is made up of a bunch of layers. And a layer is made up of a bunch of clips. And clips are made up of resources. So we've talked about this resource as a media file that we can bring in. Let's talk about each of these other components and how they all fit together. All right, back over in our project here, we can see our timelines in our left library panel in the Timelines tab. We have one timeline right now. I could add more timelines in this timeline library toolbar by hitting the plus button. We can see I've added a couple of timelines. When I select a timeline, I can see more information about it over in the inspector, as I always can. I could rename this timeline. I can also click into my timelines panel and hit F2 and say timeline training. We also have our information about our transport modes here. So play is going to play the timeline, obviously. Again, I can hit spacebar to pause the timeline. We see that here. And then I can also click on this stop button in order to stop the timeline. This is a really important one in PIXERA. Stop is going to unload content from the timeline so that it is not loaded into any cache and is not taking up any performance. Using this stop appropriately on your timelines becomes a really key component of resource management in larger projects. Some other information about our timeline here. We can look at our FPS, or frames per second, of our timeline. So I could change this to something like 30 or something like 60. A note here is that this FPS doesn't have any effect on what the engine is playing back at or what your content is playing back at. This is just a representation of how many ticks we have on the timeline. That'll become more important when we get into keyframing later on. We have some other options for our timeline. We can do something called render on top at play. And so if I select this, it will automatically render on top of all of my other timelines when I play it. I have these opacity and fading options here. So this opacity is something that I can set. So I could say 0.5, and we can see that that's mirrored here. I'm going to go ahead and play the timeline and pause it so we can see that reflected in our content itself. This fade duration is something that is triggered when we fade the timeline out using these fade in and fade out buttons, or the buttons found here. So if I press fade out, it'll fade out in 2 seconds. Or if I press fade in, it'll fade in 2 seconds. We can also click on this eyeball to access our timeline opacity. This fade to time mode is something I'll talk about when we get to queuing. And we have lots of other options here as we get deeper into the software for how we want to control our timelines, if we want to bring in something like timecode or control our timelines using an external lighting console or something. While we're talking about timelines, something that I want to mention is this white bar with the triangle here that changes when we, or starts to move when we change our transport mode. We call this white bar the now pointer. If you're in the US, you might refer to it as a playhead. This is just an indication of where on the timeline the preview and outputs are rendering. If you are outside of one of these clips, you're not rendering anything. If you're inside one, then you are. We can see the status of the now pointer in our timelines panel when we click on these transport modes, and we can see the time of our timeline here. All right, next up we have layers. So if I bring this timeline panel up a little bit, we have all of our layers. Currently we only have one. I can add more layers by double clicking here. Or I could right click to remove this. I can right click in this empty space to add a layer. Or I can, in my timeline toolbar, click on this add layer. That'll add a layer for me. These layers have properties too, just like timelines do. And if I click on this layer over in the inspector, we can see that this says layer 1. And we can see these 3 tabs here. We have a clip inspector, an FX inspector, or a setup. So this layer setup is where we're going to find all the information we need about our layers. Most important thing is I can rename this. So I could call this BG for background, or content 1, or main screen. I can also click F2 in this layer to rename this. You can also change the layer colors here. This has no bearing on programming. This is just a nice programming tool to help you see things better. As we scroll down in our layer inspector here, we have a bunch of different parameters. I want to point your attention to this layer presence. There's going to be a whole video going over this layer presence and how important it is, but I just want to point it out here. If we bring some other content onto these other layers, and I'm going to bring on some of these other videos, we can see each layer has an opacity parameter here. And we can start to see how these things stack together. So if I fade this top layer down, we can see the layer beneath it. If I fade this layer down, we can see the layer beneath it, and so on and so on. This eyeball will turn that layer on or off. And this is the duplicate layer button if I would like to create a duplicate of that layer. Again, I can right click to remove it. So after layers, we have clips. This is a clip on the timeline. I can click that clip to move it around. This sort of operates like a container. If you're familiar with Adobe products, it's a very similar concept. If I click on this clip, I can navigate to the inspector and go to the clip inspector in order to find more information about the clip. I can also double click in this layer or click on this triangle to twirl down some options there. And here I can see some of the parameters I have available in order to alter the clip. I have those options available in the inspector as well. It just depends on whether you want to work in the timeline in the layer header, or if you want to work in the clip inspector in order to do some of your programming. It's up to you. They control the same parameters. I can start to move things around here using that position value. I can see that opacity once again. And again, I have lots of different options here that we'll dig into. And of course, finally, we have our resources. And our resources can be dragged into clips while maintaining all of the properties of that clip. So if we had some parameters set on this clip, for example, if I were to bring that fade down, I can replace the resource, and that clip's properties of that 50% opacity will be maintained. Okay, so I've set up a little project here to demonstrate how our render ordering works. So I have 3 different timelines here, one with a bunch of real world content loops, one with some digital flashy content loops, and one timeline with some text on it. And I can click on them in the timelines panel here, or there's this drop down menu where I can navigate between my timelines. And we can see I've got 3 layers on the real world loops, 2 layers on the flashy loops, and I have a text layer on the end here. Now, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to play each of these timelines a little bit so they're all rendering content, or else they would be stopped and not rendering anything. And let's look at this real world loops timeline. And if I bring the opacity down of layer 1, we can see the content on layer 2. And if I fade the opacity down on layer 2, we can see the content on layer 3. And if I fade the opacity down on layer 3, we can see the top layer of the next timeline down. So what this means is that all of the layers on our topmost timeline will be rendered before we see anything on our next timeline. So if I start to fade this one down, we'll see the layer beneath it. And I can fade this one down and we can see the text. Now, if we go back, I can bring all those back up. I could also fade each timeline down as a whole composition. And we'll see that all those contents fade out together before we see the layers or the timeline beneath it. Something to notice here is that our naming conventions don't matter here. I could drag this layer 3 up on top, and if I fade this down, we can see that that layer 3 is now on top. I could put layer 2 all the way on top. These numbers don't mean anything, as we can rename them at will. So it is really just the stacking order. One feature I wanted to mention while we're talking about timeline render order is this render on top at play, which I briefly mentioned before. We can click on this render on top at play on a timeline that's beneath our top timeline. And when we play it, it will render on top of the entire stack, no matter what's happening on it. So if I click pause, then I activate it on this one lower in the stack. You can only ever have one of these active at a time. So when I play this, this text timeline will jump to the top of my stack here, but the real world loops and flashy loops will go back to their standard stacking order. So we'll see the text timeline on top of the real world loops, and the flashy loops will now be hidden behind the real world loops. Let's see that in action. So using this render on top at play, we can start to break some of the conventions of our layer stacking or timeline stacking order. Let's talk about some good shortcuts when working with timelines and layers. I can change the line height of an individual layer by hovering over the layer heading and resizing that layer. I can also hold Shift while doing that and resize all of those layers at the same time. That same function can be accomplished using this button here, which will resize the line height of my layers. I can also use Control mouse wheel to zoom in and out on this white now pointer. This is what we call the playhead. If I do Control Alt mouse wheel, then I'll zoom in and out on the mouse location. So it's a way to navigate the timeline a little easier. Holding Shift will allow me to scroll on the timeline. I can also select a bunch of clips together using Control Select. So I'm holding the Control key to do that. And then I can resize all of these at the same time. While I'm navigating in here, I have this vertical and horizontal axis lock. So if I wanted to move a bunch of clips further on the timeline without accidentally making new layers, I could click on the horizontal lock, and now it won't allow me to move these vertically. Or I can click on the vertical lock to just move them vertically, and I won't be able to change the time. And you can see that if I do drag vertically, it's creating a new layer as I go. Another set of timeline navigation tools comes in the ability to use our shift arrow key to jump to the start or end of a clip, which can be really handy. I can also right click in any space that doesn't have a clip on it, and I get a select all option where I could say select all clips, and now I can move them all at the same time. I also get the option to select all preceding the now pointer or select all following the now pointer. Another quick shortcut is I can actually drag clips on top of each other in order to get a crossfade between them. A note here that this will crossfade any parameters that you have, including size and the effects or anything else you've got going on. So just be careful, as you can get into trouble doing this crossfade, but it's handy in a pinch. All right, let's talk about another property of clips that allows us to better organize our timeline, and we can get pretty creative with how we use this, and that is clip play mode. This is located in the clip inspector right up here, and we've got 5 different options here. So let's look at the first one, lock to time. If I play the timeline here, then with lock to time, the content will play in time with the timeline until we hit the pause transport mode on the timeline, in which case the content would pause as well. So let's take a look at that. Hit play. There's a faint gray line here. That gray line is indicating our loop point, which you'll notice in the content, as this is not a perfect loop. And there's our loop, and we just keep going. And if I pause the timeline, then the content pauses, doesn't keep playing. Pretty simple. If we go to the lock to time no loop, which is this next layer here, again, I've changed that play mode. Then when we get to this faint gray line, it's just going to hold the last frame for as long as the now pointer is within this clip. Notice that that differs from our lock to time. If I make this a little longer, you can see there's more gray bars indicating where the loop points are. With lock to time no loop, we don't have any extra gray bars here. Free play once is pretty self-explanatory. If the now pointer is in the clip, the content's going to play even if our timeline is in pause. And we can see that it'll get to that last frame, and it's just going to hold that last frame, free playing itself one time. So there's that free play once. The next one is free loop. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Whenever this now pointer is within this clip, the content's going to be looping. This can be really handy for a really long clip that you don't want to waste a bunch of timeline on, and you know that it's just going to play over and over and over. Our final one is show Inpoint. This is essentially a freeze frame or a grab frame. If I click over to here, it's just going to show the endpoint of that clip. We can access the endpoint in our clip inspector under timing, where we can actually access both the endpoint and the outpoint of a clip. Zeros are going to indicate whatever the default is. So in this case, some 10 or 15 second clip. I could change this to 3 seconds, and we see that that clip is actually updated. Let's change it to 5. We can see that that endpoint is changing. I could go to the free loop and change this to be from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. And now this free loop is just going to loop those 2 seconds over and over. We also have a tool here called the cut tool located in our timeline toolbar. This cut tool is a toggle. And if I hover over a layer right towards the top, we get a little cut icon. If I click here, it says click to cut, alt drag to roll. So if I click to cut, it's going to cut that video into two, where the in point and out point are based on where we've made that cut. I can also use the Alt drag to roll. So if I Alt and drag, we can see that it's actually going to change the in point. So you can see that that's actually rolling that clip so that it's a much faster loop. And so if we play this lock to time, it's just going to be the last couple of seconds here. So those are some quick ways to edit the in points and the out points of a clip.